Spiritual Director for Family Life International. I should like to begin by welcoming everyone present. We start, of course, with the most important person, that is our Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them." So we are certain that he is with us, among us. We ask his particular inspiration that whatever we learn might sink deep into our hearts and become rooted in our lives. I'd also next like to welcome the guest speakers. There are 5 in number. 3 from the other side of the Atlantic, Greg Cunningham and Joel Bockrath from the USA, and myself from the Caribbean. And we have Timothy Tyndall Robertson and my brother Greg Clovis, who will be, all 5 of us will be speaking this morning. And of course, you also, the participants, the audience, you are very valuable, very important part of this conference, because what you will hear, you will not hear from any other source. You won't hear it from the media. You won't hear it from the pulpit. This, unfortunately, is the only place you will hear it. And so, remembering what our Lord said in the 13th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, a sower went out to sow and scatter the seed. And some fell on the path. Some fell among rocks. Some fell among thorns. And only a quarter fell on good soil. So, please God, this is the good soil. And so what you hear, we could say in secret, you have an obligation, I'm afraid, to proclaim from the housetops. So that is the spirit with which we will begin this conference. Joel Bockrath, our first speaker, who will speak on the myth of overpopulation. Joel is the Executive Vice President of Population Research Institute, also known as PRI. Joel and his wife, Mary Elizabeth, are the parents of 6 children. Joel, together with Steve Mosher, run PRI, which is a leading non-profit research group whose goals include the exposure of the myth of overpopulation and the human rights abuses committed in population control programs. PRI makes the case that people are the world's greatest resource. PRI is a member of the FLI group with global network in over 30 countries. And so I'd ask you to welcome our brother and our friend, Joel Bockrath.
So thank you, Archbishop, for allowing us the venue of your grounds in your hall, and Father Clovis as well for being here. I wish to thank you and Mr. Greg Clovis for the various efforts you've undergone in bringing us together under the mantle of Our Lady of Fatima. I wish to thank you as well for the invitation to speak today amongst such a notable list of pro-life advocates. I'm happy to be here today as well because Our Lady's message 95 years ago of prayer, penance, and sacrifice is as much needed as it was in 1917. Our Lady knows that we face a cultural war that's global and that we are engaged alongside her and her son to fight with spiritual weapons of divine origin and pray for the time of peace which she promised us. But we are up against highly organized forces that want to make a name and a world for themselves, absent of Jesus Christ and the light he brings. Now, before I go any further, my presence here today was somewhat touch and go. And I wanted to ask for your prayers for my son, Mark. He is 8 months old. He is our 6th child, and he was diagnosed on Saturday with pre-asthmatic conditions. It was very disturbing because his breathing was very labored. We had to take him to the emergency room. So I was just going to ask you for your prayers as a pro-life community. So You've undoubtedly heard the expression that ideas have consequences. The idea of overpopulation is an idea that is important to refute in today's climate. Why do we at the Population Research Institute strive to overcome this idea? We strive to overcome this idea first because we see every human person as unique and unrepeatable, bringing with them gifts and talents and a mission. As such, we see humanity as its own most valuable resource, far and above anything else that's available to us. And second, we strive to overcome this myth because it has evil consequences in the lives it touches. And it has touched not millions, rather, it has touched billions of lives. This myth of overpopulation has proliferated under intensive propaganda programs so that most everywhere now people accept and argue that too many people endanger us and our fragile world. It has become the open premise for the decision-making and activity of many individuals and peoples. This myth of overpopulation has even been used to justify atrocities like forced abortion and forced sterilization in family planning programs spanning the globe. The work of PRI includes having investigated and documented these human rights abuses in over 50 countries, cataloging over 150 cases involving hundreds of thousands of people. We've been at this now for over 20 years, but the myth has been around far longer. Its most proximate beginnings stretch back at least 200 years. Now, my country, the United States, spends billions of tax dollars each year to control what they consider a threatening problem in the world, that of too many people. Your tax pounds also find their way into many aid programs on the same supposed problem of too many people. The UN receives even more funding from governments around the world to help count, track, and solve this same supposed problem of too many people. The universities and other levels of education, the media and their friends, the leaders of various nations are all working hard to solve this problem, with its unquestioned virility involving so many trusted institutions. How could anyone question its validity? And while some may not agree with, say, forced abortion or forced sterilization, they agree in principle with the idea that there are too many people in the world. It seems self-evident to them the world's population has grown tremendously over the last century. And even if we seem to be doing just fine right now, they argue we're a generation or two away from disastrous consequences. Disastrous consequences if we don't slow down our rate of growth. These institutions build a frightful image of the future. Yet, do we know for certain that this image is photographic or is it illusory? That's a hard question for most of us to answer. But would you believe that it can be analyzed? Would you believe that it can be evaluated? Come with me today and become a believer that, yes, it can. And the myth can be exposed as an illusory piece. To do this, let's look at 4 parts of the myth that are commonly discussed. How did this get started, this idea of overpopulation? And do we have enough land? Are we growing out of control? Do many people go hungry because there are too many of us? And does overpopulation, in fact, cause poverty? At PRI, we took these hotly contested ideas and put the dialogue into short animations that have really caught a lot of attention. Would you believe that over 1 million people have seen these videos that we've put together, none of which are really over 2 minutes? So to begin, let's look at our first animation. We called this the making of a myth. And we launched it in late July of 2009. To date, it has nearly 420,000 views.
The myth of overpopulation originated in England in 1798, when a vicar named Thomas Malthus, who fancied himself something of a mathematician, saw that food production increased incrementally, but people reproduced exponentially. He sat down and did some simple math, and summarily decided that the world would be out of food by 1890. He blamed reduced mortality rates, and recommended killing off the have-nots of society, lest the haves starve to death. This cry was taken up by Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University in 1968, who claimed that reckless human reproduction had overwhelmed the Earth. Massive famines would result, which would destroy, best case scenario, 1/5 of humanity by the end of the 70s. And the planet would follow. This fear produced large donations for the newly created UNFPA, which thrives on an imagined crisis that has been both imminent and rescheduled again and again over the past 2 centuries. The truth of the matter is that every family on this planet could have a house with a yard and all live together on a landmass the size of Texas, which is really just a small corner of the planet. The population of Earth will peak in 30 years and then start to go back down. We're not overpopulated. Do the math.
So as you can see, a lot has been distilled from the dialogue into about 1.5 minutes. And it's something that people can catch more than just sitting like in a presentation like this. They can pause it, they can review it, they can look at it multiple times. And then they can share with their friends, they can comment, it's on YouTube. You can go and type us in, you can find us. So it's really, it's been a very powerful piece. And the others are very much like it. So we've tried to keep that genre, what the term that goes around the office is snarky. So, but let's look at a couple of notes from this one that will help in the dialogue. So, there are many that would have us think that we're overcrowded already, to say nothing of the future. Although few people stop to think about it, much of the overpopulation conversation cites issues more or less localized in cities and regions. But let's step back from the local for a second and provide ourselves some context for this myth of not enough land for us and our children. There are currently a little more than 7 billion of us in the family dwelling we call Earth. Now, I'm not suggesting that we do this any more than I suggest we cram ourselves into any small space to prove a point. But if we take the land mass available in one small corner that the United States calls Texas, we can provide ourselves some of that context that we're looking for. As you saw, you do the math of the amount of land area, you divide it into the number of people, and you get about a 33-foot by 33-foot plot of land. And that's certainly enough to make the case, just visually, that, okay, so Texas can hold 7 billion people. That leaves the entire rest of the world to develop infrastructure that is there to support people. We use the UN statistics, so it's not something that's debatable in terms of the numbers. So given an average 4-person family, every family would have 66 by 66 feet. And that's our units of measure, of course, of land, which would comfortably provide a single family home and a yard, and all of them can fit on a landmass the size of Texas. So admittedly, it's basically one massive subdivision, but Texas is a tiny portion of inhabitable land across the face of the world. So such an arrangement would leave the entire rest of the world vacant. And that's plenty of space for us. This effectively, I wish I had a balloon, this effectively busts the myth that there's not enough land to really support and sustain us. We have plenty of space left over in the world to establish and sustain infrastructure, churches, schools, malls, political systems, if they're not too greedy, zoos, countryside, art galleries, and football, rugby, polo, and cricket fields. Would you believe that even if we could quadrupled our numbers, so we went up to 28 billion, that's still approximately half the size of the United States. You're still talking about an excessive amount of land available to people. So now, let's move from this argument to the next one using the video that explores the question, is the world's population growing too fast? This one is called 2.1 Kids. We uploaded this one on February 16th in 2010, and it has nearly 300,000 views.
From the time of the cavemen all the way until today, humanity continues to exist because each generation of people has produced another generation to replace itself. Scientists have figured out how many people need to be born each generation to replace the generation before. That number is 1 person per person. All things being equal, this creates perfect demographic balance. Since women are the only ones who can have children, replacing every person on Earth means each woman needs to have 2 children, one to replace her, and the other to replace the man who cannot have children. The total fertility rate is the average number of children each woman in a society is having. This number shows us if a society is growing or shrinking. In developed countries, the replacement rate birth rate is 2.1 children per woman. This will keep the population stable, but even that is assuming that every woman has children and that there are no wars, famines, or disease. In the real world, disasters happen all the time, and sadly not all children reach adulthood, especially in poor countries. This pushes their replacement rate up to 3.3 children per woman. Since not every woman wants to have children, in order to keep the population stable, some women need to have more than 2.1 children to balance the birth rate with the women who are only having 1 or no children at all. Maintaining this balance is of the utmost importance. If society does not at least replace itself every generation, human numbers begin to fall exponentially. Economic and social problems appear as elderly people retiring begin to outnumber young people entering the workplace. This is already happening all over the developed world. Many of the world's nations are only barely replacing themselves, while a growing majority have birth rates below replacement, some as low as 1.8 or even 1.2 babies per woman. Many societies are facing a very real danger: extinction.
This part of an argument, when you're sitting down with someone in the lunchroom or someone at your neighbor's house, this can start out in a number of ways. But regardless, it can be made very engaging with some very simple data. We'll need to clarify some of the tools in this discussion. The first one is called total fertility rate, or TFR. As you noticed, this number is generally very small. You saw that in that's the next video. You saw that when you were looking at what it takes to replace the people or the nation, the people in the nation. That's a 2.1. TFR tells us how many children a woman is having in her lifetime, on average, for a given nation or people. Using this, you can see accurately and easily where a nation or people are headed. And if you think about it, how many children would it take per woman to replace a nation's people in the rising generation? Of course, you've seen the video now, and you know it's not just 2, it's 2.1, because there's a level of infant mortality that just needs to be taken into account. The replacement rate simply quantifies the zero population growth, or ZPG. You've most likely heard ZPG in discussions. The replacement rate is not the same, though, for every nation. The 2.1 factor is a peacetime number for the developed world. So there are several other factors that could influence the replacement rate, such as war, famine, pestilence, environmental catastrophes, just to name a few. Much of the developing world needs close to 3.3, though, in order to achieve replacement because of these and other factors that impact their mortality and the growth of their people. These tools really help to contextualize some of the information in the dialogue, especially when looking at nations around the world. Would you believe me, for instance, if I told you that there are nearly 107 countries now in the world that are below replacement rate? And there are only 220 nations that are, followed. According to the CIA World Factbook and the United Nations, these 107 nations comprise about half the population in the entire world. So you don't have to look too hard to see that we're not facing a population explosion. Half the world's population are not replacing themselves. And that means we are shrinking. We're not growing. Now, how can I say that with such confidence when our population continues to increase? Because the data shows that we are slowing our rate of growth and shrinking. There are two major reasons for this. Today, more people are living longer lives due to the advancements in medical care and its general availability. As my president, Steve Mosher, likes to point out, the past century did not see a population boom because we bred ourselves like rabbits. Rather, we ceased dying like flies. And the data shows this. 107 countries are showing up to the game with below replacement rates. And in fact, infant mortality has dropped dramatically in the last 100 years for the same reason of medical advances, higher and more available obstetric care. So life expectancy is a major contributor to the rapid growth that we've experienced. But life expectancy isn't likely to grow substantially longer. And infant mortality is thankfully low. So low, in fact, that there is little further we can go in the developed world. So there are more of us alive at a given time than we have seen in the past. Population, however, is a zero-sum game. Even though we are living longer and fewer of our babies are dying, we all finally must pass out of this world. So as each generation passes, there are fewer to take their place. This will lead to a population decline starting about 2050, as the UN's low variant data shows very clearly. The UN, by the way, uses 3 models. They usually present their medium variant data in their official publications. However, the low variant is what has historically taken place. And so that is why PRI uses the low variant data. So when you saw the graph go up to about 8 billion by 2050, usually the UN is saying 9 billion. But that's because they're using medium variant data, whereas the 8 billion that you saw here was based on low variant data. This means that this is the last milestone we will reach before a rapid decline begins to evidence itself. In fact, in about 75 years, we'll be back to our current 7 billion. This is where the imaginary balloon comes in. So myth number 3. We should turn now to the third argument, and that is we can't possibly feed us all. This one is where we can really express our common goals of making sure that everyone has food. In fact, the UN's Declaration of Human Rights states this as a human right in its 25th article. So this topic's high-profile name is called food insecurity. Why don't they call it food scarcity? Why indeed? Let's watch the third animation PRI made and see if we can find a clue.
According to believers in overpopulation, there are so many of us on the planet that food production cannot possibly keep up. However, according to both the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Food Program, there is currently enough food on the planet for everyone to be well fed. Not only that, but we're growing this food on less land than we did in the past. This is why in the United States, for example, the government can afford to pay farmers not to grow food, but instead return their farmland to the wild. Modern technology also allows us to grow food on land where it would have been impossible to do so, even a few years ago. Agricultural experts even believe that Africa, if cultivated using modern farming methods, could eventually feed the whole world, all by itself. Then why are people in many parts of the world starving? The World Food Program lists key causes of hunger, and overpopulation is not on that list. War, one of the leading causes of world hunger, destroys crops and disrupts relief efforts. Widespread poverty prevents many from buying the food that they need. And a lack of infrastructure means that there isn't a reliable way to transport food to areas that need it. This is why reducing the number of hungry people will not make the remaining people less hungry. Those who have access to the food will continue to have access to it, and those who don't will still be hungry. Reducing population will not magically cause food to be spread around equally. And blaming overpopulation for everything does nothing but distract us from the real problems that we actually have. Think about it.
So this is of obvious concern. Food is a human right. We obviously need it to live. Everybody should have access to it, and yet everybody doesn't. We see the pictures. We read the news articles. We see it in America anyway. We see it in appeal letters that come to our houses asking for money because certain organizations are out there that are based solely on trying to get food to people in the most efficient manner possible. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb. The first words you read from him in this book are, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over." In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. That was 1968. However, as you can see, in 2012, that did not happen. In fact, the late economist Jacqueline Cassoon argued repeatedly that the Earth can sustain, and would you believe me if I told you, the food requirements of 35 or 40 billion people. In fact, our current methods of production make it possible to eliminate food insecurity. So it is interesting, therefore, to note that in 2008, the then Director General of the Food and Agricultural Organization, Jacques Diouf, asked, "How can we explain to people of good sense and good faith that it was not possible to find $30 billion a year to enable 862 million people who are hungry to enjoy the most fundamental of human rights, the right to food, and thus the right to life?" Estimates on water availability, by the way, advance a figure of $10 billion that would provide a solution to the water availability for the 1 billion people who are without clean water today. $10 billion, clean water for 1 billion people. Not bad for one generation's work, wouldn't you say? If it could only get the attention of the legislative minds. As you saw in the video, the Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Food Program both assert that there is enough food on the planet right now to feed the entire population. So why does hunger exist in 2012? The World Food Program lists as key causes of hunger to the now 952 million as, first up, natural disasters, war, poverty, limited or insufficient agricultural infrastructure. It's the same list as you saw in the video that we made a couple of years ago. And then improper farming methods. And of course, what is still missing from this list? I think you'll believe me now on this one, overpopulation. So as you can see, the data is in and has been concisely summarized, even by the UN. So how about some examples? It's good for us to remember that we use numbers to access trends. But who are we really talking about? We're talking about our neighbor, and we're talking about our future. Hunger Solution 1. The Economist magazine hails Brazil's success in agriculture as the miracle of the Cerrado. In the northeast corner of Brazil, 2 farms are on its frontier, and they're in the frontier of the Brazilian farming industry as microcosms of a national change with global implications. In less than 30 years, Brazil has turned itself from a food importer into one of the world's great breadbaskets. The increase in Brazil's farm production has been stunning. Brazil increased its beef exports tenfold in a decade, overtaking Australia as the world's largest exporter. And it has the world's largest cattle herd now, after India's. So that's the first kind of solution to the hunger problem, is increased farming methods, increased technology being applied to the farming methods of today. Hunger solution number 2. I call this one out of Africa. It's called the Guinea Savannah Zone. You got a mention of it in the video, but I'm just going to read from our website called overpopulationisamyth.com. Theoretically, it would not even require all of Africa. According to a 2009 report published by the FAO, about 400 million hectares of African savanna are quite suitable for farming, but only 10% of that land is currently cultivated. Called the Guinea Savannah Zone, this stretch of arable land winds through 25 African countries. And even though Africa has a dire history of war and unstable government, things have recently begun to look up for many of these nations, which means this land is most likely to be cultivated in the future. According to the FAO, Africa is better placed today to achieve rapid development in agriculture than either northeast Thailand or the Cerrado, with their agricultural transformation took off in 1980. There are a number of reasons for this: rapid economic, population, and urban growth, providing diverse and ample domestic markets, favorable domestic policy environments, improved business climates in many countries, increased foreign and domestic investment in agriculture, and the use of new technologies. These are 2 examples, real-world examples, of human contribution to solving complex issues of our day. The human person really is the one resource we cannot do without. So we'll now turn to the 4th section of the fourth argument. This is overpopulation causes poverty. So this video was uploaded December 6th, St. Nicholas Day, and we call it Poverty, Where We All Started.
When human beings first showed up on this planet, there weren't very many of us. And we faced a hard life of meeting our basic needs. Chances are, early humans spent a good deal of time hungry, cold, and without shelter. That is to say, poor. According to the World Bank, poverty is when people are deprived of well-being as a result of low income and aren't able to get the basic goods that they need for survival with dignity. How did any of the human race advance beyond poverty? We kept multiplying, and we formed communities. In communities, people stop spending all their time on simple survival, and are able to do things like divide up tasks, share resources, and pool their mental energies to come up with creative solutions to problems. These communities started with families, then grew into extended families, entire tribes, and then finally cities and nations. So what effect has this growth had on poverty? According to demographers, a very good one. In fact, history shows that as our numbers have grown, so has our average standard of living. Scientists measure this standard in everything from per capita income to average amount of calories consumed, even average height. And all of these averages have been increasing. Even though poverty still exists, the percentage of poor people has actually decreased as population has grown. The reason for this is that human beings are not simply consumers, we are producers. This is why, over the ages, we have learned how to do things like produce more food on less land, find better energy sources, and make sure that more people have enough to eat and a roof over their heads. And this is also why, though urban poverty is still a huge problem, statistics show that the poor who move to large communities actually have better chances of rising from poverty than they did in areas where there were fewer jobs and less opportunity. For this reason, poverty is a problem that is not solved by eliminating people. Poverty has always been a problem, even when there were scarcely any people on the entire planet. People are the only proven way out of poverty. Removing them will only leave the poor right where they started. Think about it.
There is a region of the world that has been coined the 1040 window region. This is a region of our world between the 10th and 40th degree latitude north, or perhaps, north of the equator in Africa and Asia. So it's a very small subset here. However, herein are located 2/3 of the world's population, or perhaps 4.5 billion people, in some 60 countries. 82% of the world's poor live in this 1040 window. 84% of these have the lowest quality of life in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, and literacy. These are manifestations of poverty that everyone would like to see eradicated. As you saw in the video, many of the problems of poverty and hunger can be traced to a lack of adequate law enforcement, inadequate supply systems, and other major factors that are correctable if a given people are allowed the freedoms and opportunities we've enjoyed in the West so far. This stems mainly from the views held by those in the halls of power. If they don't see themselves as servants to their people, then they are servants of themselves. They enact and enforce laws to their own benefit while their nation spirals downward economically and demographically. What is needed is a change of heart, secured and sustained by the Queen of Hearts. And I'm reminded of the proverb, the heart of the king is like channels of water in the hands of the Lord. So where do we go from here? These are the four very common arguments. Where do we go from here? We've effectively taken out those main arguments of the overpopulation myth. This myth and its fear have been used to wage a war on humanity, a war that seeks to keep humanity at odds with itself, seeks to rid itself of undesirable parts. This is not a war with aircraft carriers, guns, missiles, but with propaganda. Billions of pounds in funding, personnel, and assistance programs. Within such a war, it is important to recall that we are all descended from Adam and Eve. Pope Pius XII makes this clear in his encyclical Humane Generis. So the concept of the human family is not merely a concept after all. It has a reality and an enduring vitality. And it didn't die with Cain and Abel. That makes the familial aspect of our race unavoidable in our considerations. I'm sure you've often pondered, as we have, the words of our Savior. Whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do to me. So the human face we look into really does contain the eyes and ears and mouth of our Lord. Our response, therefore, directly involves him. Are we in need of a new heart? That's fine. If we are, allow him to fill our hearts with the love of his sacred heart. Ask him how to engage his grace and love for the sake of his good name and his beloved mankind. And so what can this look like? If the billions in annual international funding were spent on health systems that moved medicines like malaria tablets, mosquito nets, antibiotics, obstetric care, primary care, clean vaccines, clean water, and advanced methods of agriculture, we'd see a different world in 10 to 20 years. But we don't. Instead, we're busy sending condoms, IUDs, tainted vaccines, birth control pills, quinacrine tablets, and other undesirable items. But we here today are the culture of life. We're brothers of Pope John Paul the Great. And so what can we do? Some very practical endeavors can be achieved at many levels, and perhaps you've already been doing some of these. But I find that it's good to state these 10 or so ideas so that these ideas can lead to good consequences. Number 1, pray for specific married couples and families, because Mary taught us again to pray the rosary for the triumph of her Immaculate Heart and for peace in the world. Perhaps your mom hasn't heard from you in decades. So get up, dust off your rosary, welcome it with a kiss, and get busy. Support the work of groups like Family Life International and PRI that are working to end abortion, sterilization in your country. 3, support your local crisis pregnancy centers with volunteer work, donations of clothing, and maternity supplies. Perhaps when a woman is pregnant in your parish or has had a new baby, simply saying congratulations to her and the dad. Don't forget his dads. Every baby deserves to be welcomed. I find this, my wife finds this a lot. The first baby gets a shower, the first baby gets a lot of attention from the community. But the second baby and on down, somehow they get forgotten. So do what we can to remember that these children also deserve our attention. Offer words of encouragement to mothers. Motherhood is a demanding job. You can even ask the mother or the dad, what can I do to help? Offer to make a meal for the family with a new baby. Even take one to a struggling family. We're all in this together. We're going through hard economic times. We all probably know families that we can assist this way. Is there a gift you can bring? Perhaps flowers, a baby blanket, baby clothes? Start a parish program for moms and families of new babies. This would include meals, perhaps helping around the house or the yard. Kimberly Hahn, wife of Scott Hahn, in her book, Life-Giving Love, gives 7 pages of these kinds of ideas for each stage of pregnancy, as well as after the birth, support after miscarriage, and when the dad is away on a trip, like me. There's even a list called Ideas for Husbands. And it's a great book besides. It's about 350 pages. It's called Life-Giving Love. All right, learn the issues involved, and if possible, write opinion editorials for your own local news outlets. Start a blog. Make a Facebook group. Become a news aggregator. If possible, let your legislative representatives on local and national levels get to know them, get to know their offices so you can communicate with their offices on legislation important to these issues. And there are a ton of ideas once you get started that can get on the way to implementation. In the words of St. Pio, pray, hope, and don't worry. Thank you for listening.
Yes, Graziano Freschi, I'm fully behind you. The question I have, are you represented at the centers of power like UN, or where the decision making is taking place? Because as you know, most of these organizations are actually controlled by the population controllers. For example, in this country, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Charles, and the Gates Foundation in the US, all the great and the good are for the anti-life agenda and dressed up as. Are you got sort of a presence at the UN, the FAO? Are you in a lobbying position? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. What you're referring to, I believe, is a permanent presence. And unfortunately, we're too small. We are small, we're mighty, but we're just not there yet. That is one idea that we have had in terms of a future project, is having a permanent base people that are at the UN and at some of the UN centers around the world, so that we could be affecting some of the documentation that's coming out. So it's not that we're not thinking about it, it's just that we're not funded for such an endeavor. That would probably take a good, we'd probably have to double our budget to do that, just for that program. Thank you very much for reminding me. Austin Ruse's organization is called CFAM. You can find him on the web, and he's an excellent source. He is a permanent, he's got permanent status there. He is walking the halls every day. He himself, perhaps not, but his group. On occasion, we have had the last ones was a couple of years ago. We probably had over 100 people go up and scatter in and among the various groups that we're putting together documentation. So yes, we're hoping to expand that effort. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. You mentioned vaccines and you differentiated between clean and tainted vaccines. What do you mean by that? And also, Bill Gates and his foundation fund the vaccination programs, and I've heard him say part of his ploy to reduce the population is by a vaccination program.
All right, this is an excellent question, and certainly has several parts to it. So, in my view, a clean vaccine is one that does not use aborted fetal tissue or aborted baby tissue in how they make it. It is documented. I think the Pope has actually come out, our current pontiff has come out and said we need to produce vaccines from alternative sources, perfectly within the scope of reasonability here, I think. So that's one differentiation that I would make. On occasion, it has been found, and we've got some documented on this, they have found tainted vaccines being used in the Philippines, I believe, that produced infertility in those that had been protected, from disease through the use of the vaccine. So that's an unfortunate piece that that is sitting there, and of course you don't know if it's going to be implemented again in trials in other parts of the world. So that's clean and tainted.
Okay.
Bill Gates. I'm not part of his foundation. I know that he comes out in terms of overpopulation on the other side. However, he has recently adopted at least a public stance that says if you increase the,
It will be, yeah. Okay.
I mean, if you decrease the maternal mortality rate and you decrease the infant mortality rate through the use of, say, preventative medicine, using the advanced medical tools that we have available to us, then there is a, and this is very well documented. In fact, PRI argues in this manner that if you provide these to people, societies, world, you create a more hygienic, say, environment, then fewer babies die, and so the families need fewer babies to do the same level of contribution, say, to society. So, so whereas the farm needs 8 to 10 children in the future, given some of these methods, more like 5 would be needed to produce the same level and take care of the family through their growing years. So that's it's kind of a natural way that is more desirable rather than going in and eliminating people by targeting them in programs. So it's just and you still get a moderate growth in your population, and you get a moderate growth in your economy. So yeah.
Okay. You've told us about land and you've told us about food. What are your findings, if any, about energy consumption and about things like peak oil and peak hydrocarbons?
That is an area that I am underqualified. However, I will touch on petrol sources. I believe are in such quantities that, given the time frame for their, say, drying up, we would certainly be able to find alternative energy sources and begin to develop those. I believe North America has petrol sources that, in Canada, that rival Saudi Arabia. It just has to be tapped. There are alternative, like shale oil fields in my country that if we were to implement known technologies for extracting the oil from shale, we could have the same amount of oil as Saudi Arabia as well. So petrol is not really, it's a driver. It's an economic driver, not just in the barrel prices, but it goes into various industries. In the machinery, for example, that drives the factories. So oil is really a key component, it's a key resource. So yeah, I would probably say that would be my first answer to that. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
we're going to answer the question, is homosexuality a sin? The church answers, as a condition, homosexuality is not a sin, but, and in quotes, a more or less strong tendency ordered towards an intrinsic moral evil. So as a condition, it's not a sin. It's a heavy cross, but as with all crosses, it's one that can be used to complete the sufferings of Christ, which is still necessary for the salvation of souls. First of all, help and sympathy should be offered to one who has a homosexual orientation and struggles against it. It is somewhat ironic that according to Funk and Wangel's New Standard Dictionary, the edition is 1919, the word gay meant loving forbidden pleasure, being wanton or dissipated or immoral. So the church tells us then that we should have sympathy for those who have found themselves with a homosexual orientation, recognize its sinfulness and struggle against it. There is a struggle in every one of us. St. Paul eloquently articulates this in the letter to the Romans, the 7th chapter, from verse 14. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, soul under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree the law is good. So then, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God, in my innermost self, but I see my members another law at war with the law of my mind, and make me captive to the law of sin which dwells in my members. And he concludes, who can save me? But only Jesus Christ. And that passage applies to all of us.
The signs we use on university campuses are shocking because abortion is shocking. These signs equate abortion with other forms of genocide because it's an equation that we can logically defend, and it's the truth, and it creates a great deal of conflict, and that conflict draws crowds. The crowds draw the press, and we get a forum to make the argument that abortion is indeed mass murder. One of the criteria by which I decide whether what I'm doing is effective is whether the other side likes it. And if they don't like it, I do more of it. And I will tell you, the other side hates these pictures so much that they follow us around with bed sheets and hold them up in front of the sign so nobody can see them. And there's a debate right now in the pro-life movement over the effectiveness of using aborted baby pictures, but there's no debate among the pro-aborts about the effectiveness of using baby pictures. They know they work. And the reason the pro-aborts are trying to hide the pictures is because the pictures force a debate that wouldn't otherwise be taking place. They start the debate and they end the debate because nobody can stand in front of these pictures and defend abortion. It's simply impossible. We've set up a series of news signs that we're using on university campuses that are designed to be provocative, because our purpose is to get people stirred up and get them to think and get them arguing with one another. That's actually one of our little girls, before and after. And we call this series the Genetic Genocide series. And this is cosmetic genocide because such a very high percentage of these little children who are diagnosed in the womb with cleft lip and palate are killed, and they're killed basically for not having pretty smiles. Intellectual genocide. 90% of children diagnosed in utero with Down syndrome, which is now detectable at 9 weeks, 90% of them are being killed. Now, lots of students who are hard of heart will look at those signs, and instead of responding as we would have them respond, their reaction is to say, well, maybe it's better that those children are killed, because they're going to have hard lives, and they're going to be discriminated against, and all of those kinds of things. And so then we show them this sign, which is our gendercide sign, that has an Economist article that documents as many as 100 million baby girls killed around the world in sex selection abortions. Gender selection abortions are being done unlawfully in the UK. It's been reported in your newspapers. The question we're asking students is, well, in many parts of the world, little girls are going to struggle. So maybe it's better that they not be born. I mean, maybe gendercide is a good thing, killing these girls. Well, suddenly they begin to see this maybe a little bit differently. Well, you know, maybe it's not as good a thing as we thought it was. And then we drop the bomb, and we show them a sign with a quote from the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association in the United States. Joel Ginsberg, who directs it, said, and I'm quoting, "Many gays fear that if gay genes are identified, it could result in discrimination, prenatal testing, and even abortions to eliminate homosexuals, because many gay activists argue that their DNA is their destiny, that it's not a choice, it's not a preferred lifestyle, it's just who they are." Well, if that's true, then it's going to be testable in utero. And surveys indicate that a high percentage of parents who could test for this would, and if the test came back positive for a genetic predisposition toward homosexuality, they'd abort the baby. And that gives us a chance to say that we would oppose those abortions too.
Too many people endanger us and our fragile world. It has become the open premise for the decision-making and activity of many individuals and peoples. This myth of overpopulation has even been used to justify atrocities like forced abortion and forced sterilization in family planning programs spanning the globe. The work of PRI includes having investigated and documented these human rights abuses in over 50 countries, cataloging over 150 cases, involving hundreds of thousands of people. We've been at this now for over 20 years, but the myth has been around far longer. Its most proximate beginnings stretch back at least 200 years. Now, my country, the United States, spends billions of tax dollars each year to control what they consider a threatening problem in the world, that of too many people. Your tax pounds also find their way into many aid programs on the same supposed problem of too many people. The UN receives even more funding from governments around the world to help count, track, and solve this same supposed problem of too many people. The universities and other levels of education, the media and their friends, the leaders of various nations, are all working hard to solve this problem, with its unquestioned virility involving so many trusted institutions. How could anyone question its validity? And while some may not agree with, say, forced abortion or forced sterilization, they agree in principle with the idea that there are too many people in the world. It seems self-evident to them the world's population has grown tremendously over the last century. And even if we seem to be doing just fine right now, they argue we're a generation or two away from disastrous consequences. Disastrous consequences if we don't slow down our rate of growth. These institutions build a frightful image of the future. Yet, do we know for certain that this image is photographic, or is it illusory? That's a hard question for most of us to answer. But would you believe that it can be analyzed? Would you believe that it can be evaluated? Come with me today and become a believer that, yes, it can. And the myth can be exposed as an illusory piece. To do this, let's look at 4 parts of the myth that are commonly discussed. How did this get started? This idea of overpopulation? And do we have enough land? Are we growing out of control? Do many people go hungry because there are too many of us? And does overpopulation, in fact, cause poverty?
The myth of overpopulation originated in England in 1798, when a vicar named Thomas Malthus, who fancied himself something of a mathematician, saw that food production increased incrementally, but people reproduced exponentially. He sat down and did some simple math, and summarily decided that the world would be out of food by 1890. He blamed reduced mortality rates, and recommended killing off the have-nots of society, lest the haves starve to death. This cry was taken up by Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University in 1968, who claimed that reckless human reproduction had overwhelmed the Earth. Massive famines would result, which would destroy, best-case scenario, 1/5 of humanity by the end of the 70s. And the planet would follow. This fear produced large donations for the newly created UNFPA, which thrives on an imagined crisis that has been both imminent and rescheduled again and again over the past 2 centuries. The truth of the matter is that every family on this planet could have a house with a yard and all live together on a landmass the size of Texas, which is really just a small corner of the planet. The population of Earth will peak in 30 years and then start to go back down. We're not overpopulated. Do the math.
So now, let's move from this argument to the next one using the video that explores the question, is the world's population growing too fast? This one is called 2.1 Kids.
From the time of the cavemen all the way until today, humanity continues to exist because each generation of people has produced another generation to replace itself. Scientists have figured out how many people need to be born each generation to replace the generation before. That number is 1 person per person. All things being equal, this creates perfect demographic balance. Since women are the only ones who can have children, replacing every person on Earth means each woman needs to have 2 children. One to replace her, and the other to replace the man, who cannot have children. The total fertility rate is the average number of children each woman in a society is having. This number shows us if a society is growing or shrinking. In developed countries, the replacement birth rate is 2.1 children per woman. This will keep the population stable, but even that is assuming that every woman has children, and that there are no wars, famines, or disease. In the real world, disasters happen all the time, and sadly not all children reach adulthood. especially in poor countries. This pushes their replacement rate up to 3.3 children per woman. Since not every woman wants to have children, in order to keep the population stable, some women need to have more than 2.1 children to balance the birth rate with the women who are only having one, or no children at all. Maintaining this balance is of the utmost importance. If society does not at least replace itself every generation, human numbers begin to fall exponentially. Economic and social problems appear as elderly people retiring begin to outnumber young people entering the workplace. This is already happening all over the developed world. Many of the world's nations are only barely replacing themselves, while a growing majority have birth rates below replacement, some as low as 1.8 or even 1.2 babies per woman. Many societies are facing a very real danger: extinction.
The number one marker for poverty in the UK really isn't ethnicity, it's not education, class, or parentage. What it actually is single parenthood and how early that starts. One of the key things we do in FLI is primarily we go into schools, we go into parishes, but schools are the key thing which we do. And it's really a great opportunity, and I'd say a great privilege, to be able to speak to young people and talk to them about chastity, to talk to them about marriage, to talk to them about family life. And it's a great sadness in many respects, because so many of them, a significant minority of them, really don't have the experience of what was very common in the 1960s and 70s, of having two parents who cared about them at home. The third prediction was this: contraception would be used by governments to implement eugenic policies. Now, most of you probably heard of China's one-child policy. Steve Mosher has actually documented this whole space, this horrific and brutal way in which the Chinese have forced on women, forced on families really, a one-child policy, literally dragging them into abortion clinics, even if they're 8 months pregnant. But also we've seen this in India, we've seen this in South America, where governments in the West primarily are funding very, very restrictive programs in South America, in Africa, because they see populations, if you like, outside of their countries as a bad thing, and they seek actually to reduce those populations. Even in the UK, you can see how you have government agencies really seducing our children as young girls as young as 13, in terms of using birth control. Now they can obtain patches, IUDs, they can all sorts of mechanisms without parental authority. Often the parents have no idea that these girls are on these very, very powerful steroids. In fact, now even teachers may not be aware, because they are now allowed to text directly to the nurse to order, whether it be condoms or order any kind of birth control mechanisms, whether it be the morning after pill, for instance. And now, because they don't even want to necessarily go through the nurse, I was listening to the Today program 2 or 3 days ago, and they were talking about girls simply going to the chemist and simply asking for the morning after pill or asking for birth control mechanisms. Our government, therefore, are using, if you like, eugenic principles primarily to thwart the possibility of conception on our young people. Now, there's no concern really about the health of these young girls. And parents not being in the loop have no idea when they have great difficulties. They have no idea they're on these very, very powerful steroids.
My wife wanted me, for a special reason, to assist her at the birth of our last child. So to see what happens when children are not wanted is truly horrific, horrific. And it made me think of the vision of hell that Our Lady showed the children in the third apparition in July. And so from that, we're going to proceed. That wasn't the end. That was shown to the children, not in order to terrify them out of their wits, but to show them that even something so awful as hell or abortion or the terrible evils that the church is suffering from and the world today have a remedy, a divine remedy, which will in the end lead to the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in the message of Fatima. So she warned that all these evils in the message of Fatima were going to come to pass. And Blessed John Paul II, one of the greatest and holiest saints of recent centuries, gave very instructive teaching on the specific nature of the errors about which Our Lady warned. So in this talk, my object is to give you God's vision, the vision of heaven that was given by God through Our Lady to 3 shepherd children, the oldest of whom was 10, in order to respond to the crisis afflicting the church and the world today, which originated in the errors of Russia, which mean, John Paul II taught, and we can all see it, because this is what we've been hearing about at this conference, the rejection and denial of God.
The myth of overpopulation originated in England in 1798, when a vicar named Thomas Malthus, who fancied himself something of a mathematician, saw that food production increased incrementally, but people reproduced exponentially. He sat down and did some simple math, and summarily decided that the world would be out of food by 1890. He blamed reduced mortality rates, and recommended killing off the have-nots of society, lest the haves starve to death. This cry was taken up by Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University in 1968, who claimed that reckless human reproduction had overwhelmed the Earth. Massive famines would result, which would destroy, best-case scenario, 1/5 of humanity by the end of the 70s. And the planet would follow. This fear produced large donations for the newly created UNFPA, which thrives on an imagined crisis that has been both imminent and rescheduled again and again over the past 2 centuries. The truth of the matter is that every family on this planet could have a house, with a yard, and all live together on a landmass the size of Texas, which is really just a small corner of the planet. The population of Earth will peak in 30 years, and then start to go back down. We're not overpopulated. Do the math. According to believers in overpopulation, there are so many of us on the planet that food production cannot possibly keep up. However, according to both the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Food Program, there is currently enough food on the planet for everyone to be well fed. Not only that, but we're growing this food on less land than we did in the past. This is why in the United States, for example, the government can afford to pay farmers not to grow food, but instead return their farmland to the wild. Modern technology also allows us to grow food on land where it would have been impossible to do so, even a few years ago. Agricultural experts even believe that Africa, if cultivated using modern farming methods, could eventually feed the whole world, all by itself. Then why are people in many parts of the world starving? The World Food Program lists key causes of hunger, and overpopulation is not on that list. War, one of the leading causes of world hunger, destroys crops and disrupts relief efforts. Widespread poverty prevents many from buying the food that they need. And a lack of infrastructure means that there isn't a reliable way to transport food to areas that need it. This is why reducing the number of hungry people will not make the remaining people less hungry. Those who have access to the food will continue to have access to it, and those who don't will still be hungry. Reducing population will not magically cause food to be spread around equally. And blaming overpopulation for everything does nothing but distract us from the real problems that we actually have. Think about it.